What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. Today is January 1st, 2026, about 2 p.m. where I'm at right now. Happy New Year to everybody out there for making it through 2025. I wish you all a prosperous, peaceful, successful, happy 2026. Let's make this year one to remember. We're going to kick off today with our 17th book in our Book to React series. This is episode 13 of A History of Psychology from Antiquity to Modernity, written by the mysterious Professor Thomas Hardy Leahey. Hopefully you've been enjoying your time that I haven't been on live by catching up on all the previous episodes of Book React and all the readings for this text as well. Without further ado, we're going to be jumping into chapter 6 today, the Enlightenment, and hopefully finishing all of it. I cannot promise that, but that will be the target. Let's get into it. The Enlightenment from 1700 to 1815. What was the Enlightenment? Enlightenment is man's release from his self-incurred tutelage. Tutelage is man's inability to make use of his understanding without direction from another. Sapere aude. Have courage to use your own reason. That is the motto of enlightenment. If we are asked, do we now live in an enlightened age? The answer is no, but we do live in an age of enlightenment. This was said by Kant in 1784. I would like to know what sapere aude means. I wish I had somebody in the chat who could put these sort of definitions in the chat. Sapere aude is a Latin phrase meaning dare to know, or more fully, have courage to use your own reason. Okay, I'm going to put this here in the description in the chat. We're going to put that here. Okay. Anyway, dare to know, dare to know. Continuing here. So, who were the others? Kant called them guardians who wanted to direct our thinking. They were the traditional leaders of European society, priests or ministers and aristocrats. Replacing these guardians defined the mission of the Enlightenment, applying reason and scientific knowledge to human life, and replacing the static view of society defined by biblical truths and traditional beliefs with a dynamic, progressive vision of history. The aim was to replace religion, the priest, and tradition, the aristocrat, with the study of nature, science, and the result of the Enlightenment was the beginning of European thought. The lamp of the Enlightenment was Isaac Newton, as Alexander Pope had written in eulogy of Newton, now carved over the fireplace in the room where Newton was born. Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night/God, said let Newton be, and there was light. Newton provided the light of the Enlightenment, and the philosophers set out to do for human affairs what Newton had done for the affairs of the universe. During the course of the 18th century, literacy spread, and as it did so, books of popular science and novels replaced religious works as bestsellers. Ordinary people became able to heed Kant's admonition to dare to know. In short, the Enlightenment is the hinge between the old world and the modern world. The Enlightenment played out differently in different countries. Histories of the Enlightenment used to focus on France as the center of the Enlightenment, claiming that as one moved away from Paris, the light got dimmer. But this picture has been rejected. The Enlightenment effectively began in Britain with the writings of John Locke. There, the reign of medieval absolutism was gradually replaced by a constitutional monarchy and a parliamentary democracy. Enlightenment intellectuals were not persecuted, nor were their writings suppressed or censored. British philosophers did not denounce religion. Locke wrote a book called The Reasonableness of Christianity, and while David Hume was an atheist and skeptical of religious miracles, he did not regard religion as sinister. In Prussia, the leading German state, the Enlightenment allied with the existing autocratic government of Frederick the Great. Frederick created a rationally ordered bureaucratic government in which he was more chief bureaucrat than divine king. Prussians applied Newton's mechanical model of the universe to the state. Johann von Euste, a leading political theorist, wrote, "A properly constituted state must be exactly analogous to a machine in which the wheels and gears are precisely adjusted to one another and subject to the will of one man." The example of Prussia shows that Enlightenment thinkers were not always partisans of democratic government, but of rational, scientifically based government. They cared more that governments govern well than that they govern by consent of the governed. Let's go up here to this picture right here. This is the Virginia State Capitol in Richmond, designed by Thomas Jefferson. The American founders were deeply influenced by the ideas and values of the classical world, and the Capitol is an outstanding example of Greek revival architecture. It recalls the Parthenon as an expression of self-confidence, in this case of a new society just beginning its way upon a radically Republican path. It was in the 18th century that the idea of a science of human nature began, and it would be in America that it would flourish. The classical revival poet Alexander Pope linked the classical past to modernity in his essay on man. "Know then thyself, presume not God to scan. The proper study of mankind is man." Going to the comments, Nelson says, "Hey Simon, hope you had a good vacation." Shout out to Nelson. Yes, I did have a good vacation. I was out in Turkey for about a week or so, and I was sick the entire time, very sick. But I feel better now, though I still have congestion up in my nose. And hopefully you had a good vacation as well. We will be doing some call-in shows this year, so everybody stay tuned to this channel as we continue to chop it up with the people and educate the people. Let's continue here. Among Britain's North American colonies, Enlightenment philosophs, okay, I've never seen this word, but I guess that's what it means. All right, among Britain's North American colonies, Enlightenment philosophs such as Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were able to create a new, rationally ordered government on what amounted to a Lockean political blank slate, separated from kings and aristocrats by the Atlantic Ocean, and home to a congeries of Protestant denominations, none of whom could become a dominant established church. The American founders in the Constitution and Declaration of Independence wrought a secular, philosophically justified new order of the ages. See the back of the dollar bill under the pyramid. In doing so, they created a uniquely individualistic form of society that would be especially receptive to psychology. In Russia, Tsars Peter the Great and Catherine the Great tried to impose the Enlightenment on the Prussian model. In Russia, Tsars Peter the Great and Catherine the Great tried to impose enlightenment on the Prussian model, but it never developed deep roots in Russian culture. Rather than being the standard setter for the Enlightenment, France was the anomaly because there the Enlightenment was alienated from political power. The Bourbon monarchy subjected all publications to strict censorship, and unlike in Britain or Germany, intellectuals were excluded from positions of political influence. There was no parliament to act as a check on royal power or to speak for ordinary people. Go into the comments section. Nelson says, when's the next call-in show? It might be today. It might be today or definitely tomorrow. I know I always say I'm going to try to do them once a week, but definitely the call-in shows will become more frequent and often on this channel. I'm going to try my best to make the call-in shows a frequent part of this channel and content. Okay? But let's continue here. The Catholic Church, itself a hierarchical institution, was the official church, and French philosophers developed a strong hatred of religion as a baneful institution that tried to keep its believers in a state of ignorance, the enemy of Kant's dare to know. French thinkers similarly regarded tradition as the stupid veneration of the people for ancient laws and customs, as Claude Helvetius put it. Another means by which to keep the populace in tutelage. As a result, French philosophers tended to push Cartesian, Newtonian, and Lockean ideas to extremes not found elsewhere. French philosophers had intellectual brilliance and fame, but they had little stake in existing social institutions, and so wanted to tear them down, which happened, bloodily and temporarily, in the French Revolution. The radical utopianism of the French Enlightenment is well conveyed in this passage from the Marquis de Condorcet, who was born in 1743 and died in 1794. Marquis de Condorcet wrote Sketch for a Historical Picture of the Human Mind, and it says, "The time will come when the sun will shine only on free men who know no master but their reason. How consoling for the philosopher who laments the errors, the crimes, the injustices which still pollute the earth, and of which he is often the victim, is this view of the human race, emancipated from its shackles, released from the empire of fate, and from that of the enemies of progress, advancing with a firm and sure step along the path of truth, virtue, and happiness." Condorcet wrote this in 1795 when slavery was at its peak. Anyway, Condorcet was an early leader of the French Revolution, but even his radicalism was too moderate for the leaders of the later revolution when it sank into terror. He lost his political position and was hounded by the revolution until he committed suicide. Nevertheless, Condorcet's Sketch was the great essay that guided American progressivism. According to its leading philosopher and early president of the American Psychological Association, John Dewey, the key Enlightenment concept was nature, often written nature to suggest it might replace God. Oh, nature with a capital N to suggest it might replace God. Especially important was human nature. The Abbe Mably wrote, "Let us study man as he is in order to teach him what he should be." And Denis Diderot, born in 1713 and died in 1785, wrote, "Man is the single place from which we must begin and to which we must refer everything." In order to reform society along scientific lines, it was necessary to inquire scientifically into human nature. Once human nature was understood, society and government could be Once human nature was understood, society and government could be reordered to suit human nature, and virtue and happiness would follow. In the 18th century, the human sciences began to become socially important because their findings would be used by reformers and revolutionaries to construct better societies. Psychology was no longer a mere philosophical inquiry into the human mind, though it remained that too. It became the basis for social engineering. Unfortunately, these Newtons of the mind, as many of them styled themselves, did not agree on what human nature was, raising troubling questions about human knowledge and human morals. Pursuing epistemology within the new framework of the way of ideas, philosophical psychologists came to question whether we could know the world as it is, or even if we could know with certainty that there is a reality outside of the Cartesian theater. Pursuing the study of social and moral behavior in the spirit of Newton and discarding centuries of religious and traditional teachings, philosophical psychologists disagreed about whether human beings were innately evil, as Hobbes had suggested, were innately virtuous, or whether there was any human nature at all outside what society made of it. The epistemological and moral questions are interrelated. If we cannot know anything with certainty, then we cannot know right from wrong with certainty. By the end of the century, especially after the horrors of the French Revolution, some thinkers began to worry about the dangers of rational inquiry into human nature and society. As Plato had suggested, if skepticism is correct, then not only is nature mysterious, so is morality. Bishop Joseph Butler, born 1692 and died in 1752, saw the practical danger in rethinking morality. Foundations of morality are like all other foundations. If you dig too much about them, the structure will come tumbling down. The philosophers made it possible for a sophisticated young man to say to his father, "The point is, father, that in the last resort, the wise man is subject to no laws. The wise man must judge for himself when to submit and when to free himself from them." Stripped of the certainties of religion and tradition, the father could only reply, "I should not be too worried if there were one or two people like you in the town. But if they all thought that way, I should go and live somewhere else." Very interesting stuff here. Gotta blow my nose real quick. Once again, apologies. Just coming off the flu. Just coming off the flu. Hopefully it's not too disturbing to you. Continuing. The Industrial Enlightenment. The modern world, and thus modernity, our modern way of life, is rooted in the Industrial Revolution that created the cornucopia of wealth and personal possibilities we enjoy today. In the developed world, few people must seriously worry about having enough to eat to survive to tomorrow, nor are our lives constrained by the static social roles of pre-modern times. Historians and economists have investigated the causes of the Industrial Revolution almost since it began. We have already touched on some of the alleged causes, such as the rise of free cities in Europe that stood outside the feudal system and encouraged entrepreneurship. Others include the rise of institutions such as banking and insurance, the shift from animal sources of power to coal, and even the spread of entrepreneurial genes. Recently, attention has shifted to the role ideas played in the making of the Industrial Revolution, to what Moiker calls the Industrial Enlightenment, and to a shift in social values from noble arete to bourgeois self-control. And if I remember, noble arete is a virtue. If I remember, let's just check real quick. Arete, meaning, this is another word for excellence or virtue. Okay. Anyway, as figure 1.4 indicated, what changed in human life about 1780 was the tremendous growth in wealth. Sometimes the origin of this new wealth has been ascribed to trade, which certainly did increase in the 18th century. However, profitable trade was carried out by humans from the beginning of time, and therefore, while trade was important to the spread of wealth, it was less important to its generation. Instead, the key to wealth creation was technologically driven innovation. Okay? All right, gonna put the word arete here real quick. Hold on. Going to put this in the chat so people can recall this, because this is one of the key phrases, right? All right. Anyway, and continuing here. In this respect, the prior scientific revolution was important to the Industrial Revolution, but not in the way it is often explained. Scientific research did not lead to critical technological advances, such as the invention of the steam engine or the water pump. They were clever inventions devised by non-scientists. However, the possibility of technological breakthroughs was encouraged by modes of thought brought into being by the scientific revolution, especially as expounded by Francis Bacon, and first brought into effect in Bacon's home country, Britain, where the Industrial Revolution began. Almost alone at the beginning of the scientific revolution, Bacon emphasized that the point of inquiry into nature was to gain power over it. Recall that ancient philosophers and proto-scientists had viewed natural philosophy as a rather passive affair, observing nature closely in order to contemplate nature's transcendent truth. Experimentation was frowned upon as ignoble, associated with slaves and merchants, not academic philosopher kings and leisured aristocrats. Bacon, on the other hand, emphasized experimentation, bending nature to human will, and application, using scientific knowledge to improve the human condition. He emphasized the accumulation and constant sifting and proofing of scientific ideas, and the dissemination of these ideas as widely as possible. In other times and places, as we have seen, discoveries tended to be kept secret and not made known for others to build upon. It was Bacon's new scientific attitude that created the scientific enlightenment, and thus the Industrial Revolution, not the new theories of the early scientists such as Newton. In the 19th century, as the Industrial Revolution spread to the rest of Europe, scientific discovery eventually came to play the role it has in today's economy, vastly increasing the sum of human wealth in the Second Industrial Revolution of 1860 and later. A key psychological and sociological change also occurred in the 18th century, the collapse of the aristocratic set of values built up by the ancient Greeks. As late as the American Revolution, elite values reflected ancient Greek ideas of eret, or virtue. In 1776, the legislature of the state of Virginia almost adopted as the motto for its state seal the phrase, Deus nobis haec otia fecit, God bestowed upon us this leisure. Such a motto reflected the antique notion that the natural rulers of society were people who did not have to work for a living, whose duty, therefore, was to tend to the nation's interests rather than their personal interests or the interests of their occupation. Politically ambitious people who had made their own fortunes rather than inheriting them in the aristocratic way typically got out of business as quickly as they could, bought land and built country houses, wore aristocratic clothes, and cultivated aristocratic taste. They regarded themselves as the better sort and looked down upon the meaner sort, the ruder sort, and the lower sort. They also looked down upon the middling sorts, but the middling sorts were the rising makers of the Industrial Revolution, who were beginning to achieve self-consciousness and to reject the ancient Greek value of noble aret, aiming to bring gentlemen down to our level, so that all ranks and conditions would come in for their just share of the wealth. This new and rising middle class adopted and above all made respectable a new set of virtues quite different from ancient virtue. It stressed acquisitiveness and upward social mobility, not conformity to a static, God-ordained social hierarchy. It stressed work, not leisure. It stressed thrift, not the conspicuous display of riches. It stressed education in the practical arts and sciences for all, not education in fine arts and philosophy for a few. In short, the modern middle-class virtues turned virtue, or traditional aret, upside down. As historian Roy Porter put it, people stopped asking how to be good and asked instead how to be happy. As we will soon see, the utilitarian calculus of happiness is a psychological key to the modern world. Very interesting. It's a very interesting way of phrasing this radical change in mindset in the view of the purpose of life. How instead of thinking how to be good or virtuous, instead, people are asking how to be happy and upwardly mobile socially. Speaking for the new American Republic, the revolutionary Thomas Paine, born 1737 and died in 1809, really spoke for the emerging enlightened world when he wrote, "We see with our own eyes, we hear with other ears, and think with other thoughts than those we formerly used. The mind once enlightened cannot again become dark." As Paine implies, the great changing taking place was less material than psychological, and seeing with new eyes raised new challenges for the emerging science of human nature, resulting in new conceptions of human mind and behavior. Interesting. Go into the questions, or go into the comments right here. Nelson says, in case you didn't know, Greek philosophers like Aristotle were basically seen as religious figures in the Middle Ages. Their theories, undisputed. They also had deep influence into Christianity and Islam. Those were covered in the previous chapters. I believe that was in chapter 4 of this book when we were talking about how Aristotle was essentially considered like the benchmark of science. And Aristotelian logic or knowledge was unchallenged for centuries in Europe. And yes, it did have a great influence on Christianity and Islam. I would also argue Plato had a great influence on Christianity and Islam as well. But very good observation, Nelson. That's somebody who's studying. This is why we appreciate Nelson on this channel. He's a smart fellow. He's a very smart fellow. Continuing here, the skeptical question, is knowledge attainable? When the philosophers of the 18th century investigated human nature in the spirit of Newtonian science, they reopened the old Greek problem of the possibility of human knowledge in a new naturalistic context. Is the human mind endowed by nature with the power to know truth, or are we limited to opinion, as the skeptics said? An irony of the scientific revolution is that while it represented a great triumph of human reason, it nevertheless cast doubt on the very possibility of human knowledge. In Newton's wake came philosophers, psychologists such as John Locke, who examined the human mind and human nature in the light of Newtonian reason, and concluded that no human opinion was free from the possibility of error, and that the very existence of the physical world was open to doubt. These were the conclusions of the great British philosophers George Berkeley and David Hume, and they were, unsurprisingly, stoutly resisted by philosophers loath to give up the possibility of secure human knowledge. Against the skepticism of Hume, the Scottish followers of Thomas Reid asserted common sense faith in human cognition and religious faith in God, who made men and women so that they might know God's world. In Germany, Immanuel Kant responded to Hume's skepticism by asserting the old claim that metaphysics was science's true foundation, but in doing so created mysteries of his own. Going on here, we're going to go who's modern, Descartes and Locke, looking at this box right here. I've noticed that in philosophy courses and texts, modern philosophy begins with Descartes as the founder of modern rationalism and Locke as the founder of modern empiricism. But the differences between them are very deep, notwithstanding the fact that their pictures of the mind are variations on the theme of ideas. I think of them as bookends on different shelves of a library. Descartes is the bookend that closes our pre-modern thought, and Locke is a bookend sitting at the beginning of modern thought. Descartes participated in the early decades of the scientific revolution, but died well before its triumph in Newton's Principia Mathematica. Indeed, he probably would have disapproved of Newton's apparent backsliding into pre-mechanistic thinking in his treatment of gravity as an unseen force acting mysteriously at a distance. This disapproval is, in fact, a facet of Descartes' living at the interface between pre-modern and modern. He had to fight hard for the new scientific mechanistic worldview, and like a politician driven by an ideology, he would have found it hard to tolerate any compromise with the past. Newton, living later and in a more tolerant country, simply posed a theory that met his needs without worrying about metaphysics. Descartes tried to look to the future, but always remained focused on old metaphysical and religious issues, such as the nature of the soul. Locke, on the other hand, was the founding thinker of the Enlightenment. He was a friend of Newton, a physician, a tutor, and most importantly, an advisor to the politicians who made the first modern political revolution, England's glorious revolution of 1688. Instead of being concerned to settle the universe's metaphysical hash, as William James once put it about himself, he set himself the more modest and practical goal of describing human nature as it was so that a government could be built around it. These days, it's easy to see for yourself. Find an online text of Descartes' Meditations and a text of Locke's essay and see which feels more comfortable. Continuing here. Human Understanding by John Locke, who lived from 1632 and died in 1704. John Locke was a friend of the scientists Isaac Newton and Robert Boyle, in whose laboratory he assisted. A member of the Royal Society, advisor and tutor to noble politicians, and at times a practicing physician. As we might expect, therefore, Locke brought a practical and empirical bent to his philosophy. His major work in psychology was an essay concerning human understanding, published in 1690, which he started writing in 1671. Like Descartes, Locke wanted to understand how the human mind works, the sources of its ideas, and the limitations of human knowledge. Locke, however, as befits a physician and practical politician, was less in the grip of a comprehensive metaphysical system than was Descartes. His picture of the mind was straightforward and, to English speakers who follow after him, commonsensical. Nevertheless, the picture of the mind painted by Locke differs from Descartes' only in details. Locke asked what the human mind knows, and then answered, "Since the mind in all its thoughts and reasonings hath no other immediate object but its own ideas, it is evident that our knowledge is only conversant about them." Like Descartes, Locke revived the copy theory of cognition, holding that the ideas are mental representations of objects. The mind does not know forms or essences, or even objects themselves, but its own ideas only. Where do our ideas come from? To this I answer in one word, from experience, in that all our knowledge is founded and derived. Our observation employed either about external sensible objects or about the internal operations of our minds is that which supplies our understandings with all the materials of thinking. These two are the fountains of knowledge, from whence all the ideas we have, or can naturally have, do spring. The first fountain of knowledge, or kind of experience, was sensation, resulting in ideas about the objects that cause sensations, including pleasures and pain. The second fountain of experience was reflection, observation of our own mental processes. In positing the process of reflection, Locke tackled an important question about the mind that had been left open by Descartes. Descartes' radical reflexivity created the Cartesian theater, which distanced the self from the experience that was projected to it on the screen of the pineal gland. According to Descartes, the self could observe and critically scrutinize the projected objects of consciousness. However, the degree to which the self could examine itself was unclear. Descartes was certain that he was a thinking thing, res cogitans, but he did not say that he knew how he thought. The two are not the same. Just as a high wire walker knows that he or she can walk on a narrow wire without knowing how he or she does it, so it is possible that Descartes might know that he thinks without knowing how he thinks. Locke proposed that in addition to observing its own experience of the outside world, sensation, the self can observe its own mental processes, reflection. The existence and trustworthiness of reflection have become an enduring problem for psychology. Immanuel Kant later answered Descartes' implicit question about self-knowledge in the negative, denying that reflection is possible at all. David Hume, on the other hand, failing to find a self, simply denied it existed, concluding that the mind was simply the sum total of its ideas. From psychology's founding as a science, research and theory have continued to divide on when, if ever, the mind can accurately observe its own operations. If it can, as Locke thought, then the task of psychology is simplified because hypotheses about mental processes can be directly tested by observation in the form of reflection. If it cannot, as most psychologists now believe, then hypotheses about mental processes can be tested only indirectly. It may be, then, that the inner workings of the human mind can never be known with certainty, or that, perhaps, there are no mental processes at all, only functions of the brain. If Descartes is usually held to be the father of modern rationalist philosophy, Locke is said to be the father of empiricism because he stated the empiricist principle that knowledge derives from the experience alone. He proposed the famous simile of the mind, the tabula rasa, or piece of white paper, on which experience writes ideas. Locke, however, was not attacking Descartes' conception of innate ideas. Rather, he opposed a large number of English writers who believed in innate moral principles, seeing in them the foundations of Christian morality. Thus, these writers could say that it was God's law, implanted in the soul, that a person should believe in God. Anyone who did not believe was depraved, and as much a moral monster as a three-legged baby would be a physical monster. Indeed, Locke himself was widely denounced as a dangerous atheist for denying innate moral truths. Locke believed the idea of innate moral and metaphysical truths to be a pillar of dogmatism. The schools of his day used rote maxims as the basis of teaching. Students were to accept them and then prove them. Locke advocated a discovery principle. Students should keep open minds, discovering truth through experience and following their own talents, instead of being forced into the straitjacket of scholastic maxims. The difference between Locke and Descartes on innate ideas was small. Descartes maintained that he found in himself ideas that he could not trace to experience, and so he concluded they were innate. But he did not insist that they be innate as fully formed ideas. Instead, he thought it was also possible that people share mental faculties that lead them to the same universal ideas. This was certainly Locke's view. There is, moreover, a great deal of innate active mental machinery in Locke's empty mind. For example, with Descartes, Locke said that language is a human species-specific trait. He wrote in his essay, God having designed man for a sociable creature, furnished him also with language. Parrots and general other birds may be taught to make articulate sounds distinct enough, which yet by no means are capable of language. Only humans can use articulate sounds to represent ideas. In his works on education, Locke held that much of a child's personality and abilities is innate. Man's basic motives to seek happiness and avoid misery are likewise innate practical principles, although, of course, they have nothing to do with truth. For Locke, the mind was not merely an empty room to be furnished by experience. Rather, it was a complex information processing device prepared to convert the materials of existence into organized human knowledge. Direct experience provides us with simple ideas, which the mental machinery then elaborates on and combines into complex ideas. Knowledge comes about as we inspect our ideas and see how they agree or disagree. The bedrock of knowledge for Locke is for Descartes was intuitively self-evident propositions. For example, we know directly and intuitively, without possibility of error, that the colors black and white are not the same. They disagree. More complex forms of knowledge arise as we deduce consequences from self-evident propositions. Like Descartes, Locke believed that in this way, all human knowledge, even ethics and aesthetics, could be systematized. Locke also addressed an increasingly pressing problem as the scientific view that the world, and possibly people, are machines became more plausible. Do we have free will? As we have seen, thinkers such as Hobbes and Spinoza denied that we do, saying that we are unfree. Locke first proposed an answer that has been popular ever since. Locke said that asking if the will is free is asking the wrong question. The proper question is whether we are free. Seen this way, the answer seemed to Locke straightforward. We are free when we are able to do what we want, but we do not consciously will our desires. Locke offered a parable in explanation. Imagine you have gone to a room to talk to someone fascinating. While you are in conversation, someone locks the door from the outside. In a sense, you are not free to leave, but as long as you do want to leave, you never feel unfree. What matters then is freedom of action, not freedom of the will. We simply want what we want, and we all want happiness. As long as we are happy getting what we wish, we feel free, and do not worry about supposed unfreedom of the will. The self, however, ought to control desire, for in the long run, happiness will be determined by our lot in heaven or hell. The economist John Maynard Keynes repudiated Locke's long-range thinking when he said, in the long run, we are all dead. Okay. Locke's version of the rational self radically separated from experience. Locke's version of the rational self radically separated from experience, which it can critically scrutinize as consciousness, proved enormously influential both in Britain, where later British philosophers built on it, and in France, where it was popularized by Voltaire, who lived from 1694 and died in 1778. As a less metaphysical, more straightforward picture of the mind than Descartes'. Nevertheless, in their psychological essentials, these two modern philosophies were strikingly alike, possessing differences of nuance not suitable. Going to the comments, Nelson says, hey Simon, do you want to watch Can't Get You Out of My Head on Call-In Show? Let's do it. Let's do it. We will watch Can't Get You Out of My Head, the Kylie Minogue documentary. We're going to watch the Kylie Minogue Can't Get You Out of My Head documentary on the Call-In Show. I promise we will. Yes, that's what we will do on the next Call-In Show. Let me just check how many pages we have in Chapter 6. I just want to see real quick. We're on page 159. Let's see how many are in Chapter 6. If I can, right here. Oh, this is quite a long chapter. We're going on to page 191. That's a very long chapter. My God. That's a the Enlightenment is a good portion of this book. My God. Okay, well, we're going to keep on trudging along. Maybe we can make it to page, let's say, 170. We'll head to page 170. That way we can finish the second part of chapter 6 in our next reading. So that's like 20 pages, right? So we're about 10 pages in. So then we'll knock out another 10. And that way it'll be like 20 or so. Yeah, because it's about 40 pages each. So let's go to 170, okay? Anyway, is there a world? Bishop George Berkeley, born 1685 and died in 1753. Berkeley's idealism. As a philosopher, Berkeley, like Descartes and Locke, wanted to place philosophy on new, secure foundations. But as a religious man, he feared that Newtonian materialism imperiled faith in God. He admired Locke and believed Locke had taken the correct road toward knowledge. However, Berkeley saw that the Cartesian Lockean way of ideas opened the door to skepticism. Locke and Descartes believed in the existence of real objects that cause our perceptions, but Berkeley saw that their belief was really a matter of unjustifiable faith. The existence of the secondary sense properties cast doubt on the appealing assumption that ideas in consciousness simply reflect objects in the world. The skeptic might ask how we know that ideas, supposed copies of objects, resemble their originals in any respect at all. Perhaps the world is completely, not partially, different from the world of consciousness. Berkeley took the bold step of asserting that ideas were not copies of anything at all. They, not things, were the ultimate reality. Berkeley believed that the skeptic's challenge derived from another assumption we all make, that matter, things, exist apart from our perceptions of them. For example, as I am sitting here word processing, I know my computer exists because I see and feel it. But when I leave the room, what grounds have I for asserting that the computer still exists? All I can say is that if I went back, I would see it, or if someone else looks for it, he or she will see it. Ultimately, then, I know the computer exists only when I or someone else sees it. More strongly, Berkeley asserted that the computer exists only when it is perceived. Berkeley's famous motto was "Esse est percipi," to exist is to be perceived. Berkeley thus refuted skepticism by an astoundingly simple assertion. Locke said that all we know are ideas. Berkeley added that therefore ideas are all that exists. The question of how ideas correspond to real objects does not arise if there are no real objects at all. Furthermore, Berkeley's philosophy rebuts atheism, for God may now be introduced as the omniscient perceiver who sees all things and so continues their existence. In a work on the history of psychology, we do not want to get embroiled in philosophical questions about what exists. It is best to view Berkeley as asking about the material world what Descartes asked about other minds. Descartes did not want us to give up our belief that other people have minds. Berkeley did not want us to give up our belief that the physical world exists. Thinking that only I have a mind and that everything else vanishes when I'm not around is impractical to the point of madness. Instead, as Descartes tried to figure out the psychological basis for our belief in other minds outside ours, Berkeley tried to figure out the psychological basis for our belief in a physical world outside our minds. Both engaged in radically reflexive introspection and set agendas for later psychological research. Interesting stuff here. We're going to take a nose break because as you know, I'm sick. Hopefully that didn't make you sick. Now, let's continue here. Why do we see the world in 3, not 2 dimensions? In this respect, Berkeley's analysis of depth perception is especially significant. An important ground for our belief in external objects is that we see objects in 3 dimensions, including a dimension of depth, a distance away from us. Yet the retinal image, the immediate or the proper object of vision, is only 2-dimensional, lacking depth. So, for example, as a friend walks away from you, you see him or her getting farther and farther away. But if we were to examine your retinal image, we would find only that the image of the friend gets smaller and smaller. You may observe that indeed your friend looks smaller, but your subjective experience is that he or she is only going farther away, not shrinking. The problem arises, how does one perceive 3 dimensions when one can only see on the retina 2 dimensions? Interesting. Berkeley's answer was that other sensations that do give clues about distance are available. For example, as an object approaches, we move the pupils of the eyes close together as we follow it. As it recedes, we move them apart. Thus, there is a regular association between an object's distance from us and the degree to which we cross our eyes to focus on it. Berkeley and others found many additional distance cues. So far, Berkeley's analysis of how we see depth is the foundation of modern analyses of depth perception. However, Berkeley went on to make the empiricist claim that the association must be learned. According to Berkeley's reasoning, infants would not know that a person was receding as the person walked away. Infants would simply see the figure shrink. Berkeley's claim that depth perception must be learned was countered later by Immanuel Kant, who asserted that depth perception is innate. The controversy between the nativist and empiricist views continued for decades. Not until the 1960s did experiments with infants show that Kant was reasonably correct. The importance of Berkeley's argument became clearer. The importance of Berkeley's argument becomes clearer if we generalize the problem to all visual experience. If you hold a blue book at right angles to your eyes, what do you see? The naive answer is to say a book. Yet, as Berkeley would argue, all you really see is a rectangular patch of blue, an idea or mental object. If you rotate the book to a 45-degree angle, what do you see? Again, you want to say a book, and in fact, you would still believe the book to be a rectangle, but Berkeley would say that what you are really seeing is a blue patch idea that now has the shape of a truncated pyramid. Berkeley's argument is that all anyone ever sees is a collection of colored patches, ideas. One must learn to see them as books, people, cats, cars, and so on. One must learn to believe one is still seeing a rectangular book when, in fact, one is seeing a truncated pyramid blue patch. Berkeley's analysis of vision supported his idealism. One's sensory and ideational world is just a collection of sensations, and one believes in the permanence of objects only because certain conditions or of sensations are regularly associated. Belief in matter is therefore a learned inference only, for matter is not directly perceived. It sounds like Berkeley was like a progenitor or an early figure in the idea of semiotics, the idea of signifiers and signs and things like that. So all things are really just signs for ideas that we have. You know, this looks like a brush, but really all you're seeing is a black polygon of shapes, and then you associate it with the brush that I cannot use and only Acti can use, though I am jealous that she can use it and not I, because I would have 360 waves, but my God, I need to shave. This is such a hairy woman. She got all this hair. Anyway, sounds like Berkeley was a semiotician. Continuing. Berkeley's analysis of vision supported his idealism. One sensory and ideational world is just a collection of sensations, and one believes in the permanence of objects only because certain collections of sensations are regularly associated. Belief in matter is therefore a learned inference only, for matter is not directly perceived. Berkeley's philosophy of the mind became the basis for at least one important psychology of consciousness, E.B. Titchener's structuralism. Berkeley has said that we are born seeing the world as isolated sensations on a two-dimensional Cartesian screen of consciousness. Titchener's research aimed to describe the Cartesian screen as it is, without inferring the existence of objects. He taught students never to commit the stimulus error, reporting as the object of introspection the thing that caused the stimuli they were to report. Instead, subjects were to describe pure consciousness as lines, curves, and color patches, pure sensations, the basic Berkeleyan building blocks of experience. Titchener also tried to show how we learn to associate stimuli together into complex ideas, such as a book or a person, in line with Berkeley's associative psychology. Berkeley had established the ultimate in skepticism. He showed that belief in a physical world of permanent objects outside the consciousness is not one that can be rationally justified, but is a psychological inference we learn to make. How then are we to get on with our lives, with philosophy, morality, and politics, if there are no certainties? An answer was found in human nature itself by the Scottish philosopher David Hume. So, I'm going to continue here. Going on to David Hume, living with skepticism. Hume was born in 1711 and died in 1776. It is evident that all sciences have a relation, greater or less, to human nature. To explain the principle of human nature, we in effect propose a complete system of the sciences, built on a foundation almost entirely new. And we cannot, built on a foundation almost entirely new, and the only one upon which they can stand with any security. And the only solid foundation we can give to this science itself must be laid on experience and observation. This was written by Hume in 1789, Treatise of Human Nature. Continuing here. What the hell? I don't know what happened here. That was crazy. All right, now we're in chapter 5. How the hell did that happen? We're not on page 190. We're on page 170 talking about David Hume. Sorry about that. Okay. 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 Sorry, I have no idea what I pressed or what happened. Hopefully, let me know if there was any issues, if you could still hear me out there. Okay. Is this where we left off? No, we're still very far. Yeah, associationism. All right. Yeah, we're going to continue reading here. All right. All right. Abdullah Siraj says, Salaam alaikum. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome here. We're just doing some ikra. We are reading. And I wonder if my Arabic is still good. I wonder if I can write out wa alaikum salam. I still have the Arabic wa alaikum. Wa alaikum salam. I wonder if I can still write it. I wonder if I could still. Yeah, I think that's actually correct. Wa alaikum salam. Hopefully my Arabic is still good. Anyway, I'm saying ana ikra, 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 ana ikra, ana ikra, something like that. Anyway, hopefully you enjoy this live stream reading. And I'm going to practice Arabic this year. I swear to God, before I die, I swear to God, I'm going to learn how to speak some fluent Arabic. I'm going to learn how to speak some fluent Arabic. I'm going to move to Austria. What else am I going to do? I'm going to get my college degrees. I'm going to become smart. I'm going to change the world. I'm going to fight for the oppressed and the poor. I'm going to have a car. You know what I'm saying? I'm going to be balling. But I'm also going to be a revolutionary. You know what I mean? And I will learn Arabic. And I will get a six-pack. And I will stop smoking. If I could do all of those things, I have a long, happy, healthy life ahead of me. Turning 36 this year, man. Time flies. Damn, I imagine being 36 and being in a totally different space in life. But you know what? These are the cards we're dealt. You know what I mean? React. Sorry. Anyway, sorry for going off on a little tirade. We're going to continue here with David Hume, Living with Skepticism. David Hume was born in 1711 and died in 1776. Let's go here. So, Locke began the attempt to replace metaphysics with psychology as the foundation for the other sciences, and Hume carried out the task in a rigorously Newtonian manner. Hume analyzed human nature as he found it in himself and in the behavior of others. Hume's aim was to replace metaphysics with psychology, his science of human nature. He wound up showing that reason alone, the Cartesian essence of the human mind, was powerless to construct usable knowledge of the world. Hume has long been depicted as the great skeptic, the man who showed we can know nothing at all, with certainty. It is better to regard him as the first post-skeptical philosopher. He believed that skepticism had been established by Berkeley and others, and wanted to move beyond skepticism to a practical philosophy that allowed us to live our lives without the certainties that Plato, Aristotle, and religion had pretended to give us. In essence, Hume taught that the philosophical quest for absolute certainty was a fool's errand, that human nature itself was enough on which to build fallible science and fallible morals. Contents of the mind. Hume began his inquiry into human nature by categorizing the contents of our minds somewhat as Locke and Descartes had done previously. They had spoken of the contents of our minds as ideas, for which Hume, following the Scottish moral philosopher Francis Hutcheson, born 1694 and died in 1746, substituted perceptions. Perceptions are then divided into two types, impressions and ideas. Impressions are essentially what we today call sensations, and ideas were, for Hume, less vivid copies of impressions. Thus, you have an immediate impression of the book before you, an impression you may recall later on as an idea, a less vivid copy of the actual experience. Both impressions and ideas come either through sensation or external objects, or through reflection, by which Hume meant our emotional experiences, or what Hume also called the passions. Passions are of two sorts: the violent passions, such as love, hate, and the other emotions we ordinarily call passions, and the calm passions, such as aesthetic and moral feelings. Figure 6.2 summarizes Hume's categories. We're going to look here at 6.2, but now we're going to go to the comment sections. Salaam alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. I wonder if I could write all that too. So here we have, all right, let's see if I can do that in Arabic. I'm going to try it. Assalam alaikum wa rahma rahma wa rahma wa rahma to. I'm gonna separate rahma to Allah. He wa rahma to Lahi wa ba ra ka two. I'm gonna put the two. Barakatu. I'm gonna put that here. I know that's probably wrong, and I haven't practiced Arabic in a while. So y'all let me know if that's right. Anyway, going on here to Hume's categorization of the content of the human mind. So we start with perceptions, and then we have we start with perceptions, then we have impressions, and then ideas. And the impressions of sensation, including pleasure and pain. And we also have the impressions that are impressions of reflection, including the passions and emotions. From those, we have violent, the usual passions, and then we have calm, aesthetic and moral sentiments of approval and disapproval. And those are Hume's categorization of the contents of the human mind. Continuing here. All right. So, finally, Hume distinguished simple and complex perceptions. A simple impression is a single, unanalyzable sensation, such as a blue spot of ink. Most impressions are complex because our senses are usually exposed to many simple sensations at once. Simple ideas are copies of simple impressions, and complex ideas are aggregates of simple ideas. This means that complex ideas may not exactly correspond to some complex impressions. You may imagine a unicorn, which of course you have never seen. However, complex ideas may always be broken down into simple ideas, which are copies of simple impressions. Your complex idea of a unicorn combines the impression or idea of a horse with the impression or idea of a horn, both of which you have experienced. Before considering how complex perceptions are formed, two important conclusions can already be drawn from Hume's category of mental content. First, Hume gave priority to impressions over ideas. Impressions bring us directly in touch with reality by perception, but ideas can be false, corresponding to nothing, such as the unicorn. Truth is to be determined by tracing ideas to impressions, and whatever ideas are found to have no empirical content, such as the idea of metaphysics and theology, are to be expunged. The second important conclusion is that Hume assigned priority to simple perceptions over complex ones. All complex perceptions are built up from our experiences of simple ones and can be completely analyzed into simple components. Hume was a psychological atomist, holding that complex ideas are built out of simple sensations. Association, the gravity of the mind. When we turn to how complex perceptions are built up out of elementary ones, we come to what Hume himself thought was his central contribution to the science of human nature, his doctrine of the association of ideas. The concept of association was not new with Hume. We have found it in Plato, Aristotle, Hobbes, and Berkeley. The phrase association of ideas was coined by Locke. However, they had used it only a limited way. Locke, for example, saw in association an obstacle to clear thinking and sound education. What Hume prized was his use of association to inquire into fundamental philosophical and psychological questions. It was the chief theoretical tool of his new science. Hume wrote in his essay, An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, "To me, there appear to be only three principles of connection among ideas, namely resemblance, contiguity in time or place, and cause and effect. In his abstract of a treatise of human nature, Hume exemplified each. Resemblance, a portrait naturally makes us think of the man it was drawn for. Contiguity, when St. Denis is mentioned, the idea of Paris naturally occurs. Causation, when we think of the Son, we are likely to carry out our attention to the Father. These are the only links that bind the parts of the universe together or connect us with any person or object exterior to ourselves, at least, said Hume, so far as regards the mind." Hume's wording reveals the influence of Newton on 18th century psychological thought. For Newton, gravity was the attractive force that binds the atomic parts of the universe together. For Hume, association is a kind of attraction which, in the mental world, will be found to have as extraordinary effects as in the natural. And the laws of association are really to us the cement of the universe, as experienced. Thus, for Hume, complex human experience, complex ideas, is at root simple ideas, derived from impressions, united together by the principle of association. As Newton did with gravity, Hume thus made association into an ultimate principle that could not be reduced further. Hume then proceeded to investigate human knowledge in light of these three, soon to be two, laws. Cause and effect is the most important law underlying most everyday reasoning. You will to lift your arm, it rises. You knock one billiard ball into another, the second one moves. You turn off a light switch, the light goes out. Cause and effect even lies at the root of the inference that a material world exists. For one assumes that the world acts on the senses so as to cause one to perceive it. However, Hume asked, whence comes our knowledge of causation? Causes are never directly perceived. Rather, we perceive a regular conjoining of two events, the feeling of intention with the subsequent movement of the arm, the motion of one ball with the subsequent motion of the second, the flipping of the switch with the subsequent extinguishing of the light, the opening of the eyes with the appearance of things. Furthermore, no rational argument can be produced to prove causation. Hume argued that belief in causes is learned through experience. As a child experiences many regular conjunctions of events, a propensity of the child's mind leads to the firm conviction that the first event caused the second. This propensity also brings along a feeling of necessity. Causation is not simply correlation for Hume. It is a feeling of necessity between two events. This means, of course, that cause and effect is not a basic principle of association because it is reducible to contiguity plus the feeling of necessity. Hume generalized his argument to all generalizations. When one claims all swans are white, it is the basis of experiencing a number of swans, all of which were white. One then assumes that future swans in one's experience will also be white, and one therefore draws the conclusion. It is quite like assuming, based on past experiences, the light will go out when one flips the switch. In neither case, however, can the generalizations be given a rational justification, for they are based on experience, not on reason. No principle of reason underlies empirical generalizations, but we do make them, and Hume wanted to explain how we do so in order to have a complete theory of human nature. The principle Hume employed is the principle of custom or habit. In Inquiry, Hume wrote, for whenever the repetition of any particular act or operation produces a propensity to renew the same act or operation without being impelled by any reasoning or process of the understanding, we always say that this propensity is the effect of custom. All inferences from experience are effects of custom habit, not of reasoning. Moving on to Hume's adaptive skepticism. It was and is frequently assumed by Hume's readers that by reducing causation and inductive generalization to habit, he is denying their validity, and that he must have been a total skeptic, surprised each morning to find that the sun had risen. This assumption is wrong. Hume wrote more as a psychologist than a philosopher, trying to find out how we reach causal and inductive conclusions rather than being concerned with their validity. He discovered that reason is not involved, but he did not, therefore, have to deny the validity of causation and induction. In fact, Hume, in 1740, wrote, as this operation from the mind, by which we infer effects from causes and vice versa, is so essential to the subsistence of all human creatures, it is not probable that it could be trusted to the fallacious deduction of our reason, which is slow, appears not in any degree during infancy, and at best is extremely liable to error and mistake. Further, the wisdom of nature has implanted in us this instinct, or mechanical tendency that is infallible in its operation and appears at birth. Thus, the ability to form general conclusions or habits is founded on association, on our propensity to generalize from limited instances, and our propensity to feel causes necessarily linked to effects. This ability to generalize is innate and infallible, and of its operations we are ignorant. Habit is a surer guide to the world than reason. In support of this conclusion, Hume noted that the same generalizing tendency is present in animals. Their practical knowledge of the world is nearly faultless, yet they do not possess reason. Animals learn habits, and according to Hume, any theory by which we explain the operations of the understanding in man will acquire additional authority if we find the same theory is requisite to explain the same phenomenon in other animals. Other philosophers had stressed human uniqueness, but Hume here stressed their similarity to animals, implying the value of a comparative approach to the human and animal mind. As a consequence of his views, Hume made a statement that seems startling coming from a philosopher in the age of reason. He writes in a Treatise of Human Nature, published in 1789, "Reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to be any other office than to serve and obey them. This is quite natural given Hume's position. Reason is helpless to know reality. It must serve experience and the instinct of generalization, which reflect the world as it is. For Hume, morality is a matter of feeling, passion. We approve and disapprove the actions of ourselves and others according to how we feel about them, and reason must thus serve our moral sentiments." Hume resisted skepticism by relying on human nature. As he and others pointed out, the most extreme skeptic never behaves according to his beliefs. He always assumes there will be a tomorrow. Hume wrote in his Inquiry in 1777, "No durable good can ever result from excessive skepticism, nor can it hope that its influence will be beneficial to society." Hume preferred a moderate skepticism, one that accepts the limits of reason, one that properly values animal nature and knows that general conclusions may be false. After all, there are black swans. Such a skepticism is practical. It does not doubt the accumulated wisdom of experience, and useful. It preaches toleration and provides a science of human nature for the proper founding of the other sciences. Hume's system epitomized one of the two main ways of thinking about the mind that dominated the next century, associative empiricism. The other is Kantian idealism, which we shall meet presently. In Hume's version of the Cartesian theater, the mind is all surface, the screen upon which sensations and images appear. Empiricists hold that one ought not to believe in things that cannot be observed, and in this spirit Hume went searching for his self. However, he could find nothing in consciousness except sensations of the world and the body, and as a good empiricist, Hume concluded that, like God, the self was an illusion. He was never happy with this conclusion, but he could see no way around it. Thus, in Hume's view, the mind is a collection of sensations bound together by association. The job of psychology then was to catalog the sensory elements of the mind and describe how the laws of association bind them together as gravity binds together physical elements. I mean, that's a very wild conception that, essentially there is no self. It's just a collection of associations in the mind that we use to create what we call the self. Very interesting. Never thought about it that way, though I do see some logic in it. Continuing here. In Hume's work, we also see the first glimmerings of the psychology of adaptation. At bottom, human knowledge is habit, whether mental as with Hume or behavioral as with the behaviorist. Hume stressed the practical knowledge of the everyday world that lets us adapt to our environment, as would post-Darwinian American and British psychologists. Hume appealed to human continuity with animals, as would psychologists after Darwin, especially the behaviorists. Hume viewed feeling the passions as an essential part of human nature. A person is not a pure rational soul locked in a material, passionate body, as Plato held. Finally, in preferring one theory to another because of its social and practical utility, Hume also anticipated those American psychologists for whom one defect of structuralism was its avowed practical inutility. Hume also anticipated those American psychologists for whom one defect of structuralism was its avowed practical inutility. As had Socrates, the sophist, and the atomist, Hume annoyed minds incapable of living without at least the possibility of knowing fixed and eternal truths. Although Hume simply taught how to live in a world without absolute certainties, his critics took him to be much more dangerous. For them, Hume was at worst an aesthetical advocate of skepticism, reveling in the destruction of knowledge, or at best a dead end, demonstrating by his skepticism the necessary futility of empiricist philosophy. In reply, Hume's critics cited God-given common sense or alleged proofs of the necessary character of all experience. Continuing here with associationism. The doctrine of the association of ideas as developed by Locke, Berkeley, and Hume provided a simple, potentially scientific, yet flexible theory of the human cognitive processes. David Hartley, who was born in 1705 and died in 1757, in his book Observations on Man, which came out in 1749, further developed associationism as a psychological doctrine and provided a speculative neurophysiological theory to explain the mental laws of association, taking a step toward the uniting of mental and medical science. Although Hartley's psychological ideas often resembled Hume's, Hartley developed them from the work of John Gay, who lived from 1699 and died in 1745. In typical Enlightenment fashion, Hartley drove to see the mind through Newtonian eyes and even adopted Newton's own proposals about the operations of the nerves. Hartley believed in a close correspondence between the mind and brain, Hartley believed in a close correspondence between the mind and brain, and he proposed parallel laws of association for both. He was not a strict parallelist like Leibniz, however, for he believed that mental events causally depend on neural events. Beginning with the mental sphere, Hartley built up the mind from simple atomic units of sensation, as did Hume. Our sensory contact with a perceivable quality, what Hartley called an impression, causes a sensation similar to Hume's impression to arise in the mind. If the mind copies the sensation, this constitutes a simple idea of sensation, comparable to Hume's simple ideas, which may be compounded via association to form complex intellectual ideas, comparable to Hume's complex ideas. Turning to the physiological substrate of association formation, Hartley adopted Newton's theory of nervous vibrations, which said that the nerves contain submicroscopic particles whose vibrations pass along through the nerves and constitute neural activity. An impression started the sensory nerve substance vibrating, and this vibration passed to the brain, where it brought a sensation to the mind. Repeated occurrence created a tendency in the cortex to permanently copy this vibration as a smaller vibration or vibranitude or vibrantioncle. Okay, that's a vibrantioncle. Anyway, repeated occurrences created a tendency in the cortex to permanently copy this vibration as a smaller vibration corresponding to an idea. Hartley's associationism was quite popular. Joseph Priestley, born 1733 and died in 1804, a great chemist and the co-discoverer of oxygen, propounded it to the public and defended it against critics. It was also quite influential in artistic and literary circles because it deeply affected the critical sensibility of turn-of-the-century artists, especially the Romantics. Coleridge named his eldest son David Hartley. In the long run, associationism eventually gave rise to analysis of behavior in terms of associated habits. Because Hartley said pleasure and pain accompanied sensations and so affected thought and action, associationism linked up with utilitarianism. So here's the figure 6.3, David Hartley's physiological theory of associationism. So, yeah, it starts, with impression, let's say. We have mental events and bodily events. The mental events create sensation, which lead to ideas, right? The bodily events create vibrational nerves that create sensations. Vibrational nerves create the sensations. And vibrations in the brain cause ideas as well. So that's how it works, okay, in Hartley's conception. All right, the reassertion of common sense, the Scottish school. Some of Hume's philosophical countrymen regarded Hume as having fallen victim to a sort of metaphysical lunacy. Total despised philosophy and renounce its guidance. Let my soul dwell with common sense, wrote Thomas Reid, who lived from 1710 to 1796. Thomas Reid was the founder of the movement, the Common Sense School of the Scottish School. That's who Thomas Reid was a part of. In addition to Thomas Reid, other members of the Scottish school included James Beattie, who was born in 1735 and died in 1803, popularizer and polemicist against Hume, and Reid's student Dugald Stewart, who was born in 1753 and died in 1828. Reviving realism. Reid did not object to scientifically inquiring into the workings of the human mind, writing, "It must be by an anatomy of the mind that we can discover its powers and principles." But Reid did believe that philosophy had begun to go astray with the creation of the Cartesian theater, though he did not use the term, and the way of ideas, his phrase. According to the model of Descartes and Locke, the mind is not acquainted with objects themselves, but only with their copies, ideas, projected into consciousness. Here, Reid thought, was the first step towards skepticism, because if the mind works as Descartes and Locke say, then there is no way of ensuring that ideas are veridical copies of objects. Veridical. I have to look up this word. Veridical definition. Hold up. Veridical definition. Truthful. Okay. Coinciding with reality. Okay. We got that here. I'm going to drop that in the chat for all the people out here. All right. Veridical. Okay. All right. Conforming with reality. Anyway. According to the model of Descartes and Locke, the mind is not acquainted with objects themselves, but only with their copies, ideas, projected into consciousness. Here, Reid thought, was the first step towards skepticism, because if the mind works as Descartes and Locke say, then there is no way of ensuring that ideas are truthful copies of objects. We can never inspect objects themselves and compare them to their representations. In a contemporary parallel, imagine a photocopy is taken of an original document that we have not seen, and we are then allowed to look only at the copies. We assume that the copies resemble the original, but because we cannot look at the original itself, we cannot justify our assumption. Had Berkeley seen the same problem, he would have responded by saying there was no original document. For Berkeley, the copy machine, the mind itself, made the copies out of bits and pieces of sensations, but the copies correspond to no original. As long as the machine of the mind produced a stable and coherent experience, we could study it and build science on it. Reid founded common sense philosophy by eliminating the copier. He returned to the older, intuitively appealing Aristotelian view that perception simply records the world as it is. He maintained that there are 3, not 4, elements in perception: the perceiver, the act of perception, and the real object. There is no separate stage of representation as in the Cartesian theater. Our perceptual acts make direct contact with objects, not only with their representative ideas. We know the world We know the world in a direct, unmediated way that is consistent with what each of us believes without the misleading tutoring of philosophy. This view is known to philosophers as direct realism, in contradistinction to Descartes, Locke's, and Hume's representational realism and Berkeley's and Kant's idealism. Reid also raised two issues that were important to later psychology. First, Reid rejected the theory found in Berkeley, Locke, Hume, and Kant that conscious experience is manufactured out of bits and pieces of sensations. Because we directly experience objects as they are, there is no need to posit a gravity of the mind or force of sensation that holds complex impressions and ideas together. Reid acknowledged that one can artificially analyze complex impressions into simple ones, but he denied that doing so returned one to the raw material of experience, pure sensations. For Reid, the raw material of experience is objects themselves. Most later psychologists would follow Hume or Kant in seeing experience as manufactured out of simpler bits. But realism was kept alive by Franz Brentano, the Gestalt psychologist and the phenomenologist in Germany, and by William James in America. They, like the Scots, refused to think of the mind as a machine shop manufacturing experiences out of pieces of mind stuff. As modern roboticist Rodney Brooks in 1991 puts it, you don't need representations in a cognitive system because the world is its own best representation. As a realist, Reid believed that perception is always meaningful. Concepts are mental symbols that stand for something real. Perception is thus like language. Like the medievals, Reid believed we get knowledge by reading the book of the world, which tells us the meaning of reality as surely as reading a book tells us its meaning. Complex experience cannot be reduced to atomic sensations without robbing it of something vital, its meaning. Reid's nativism. The second general point central to Reid's philosophy is his own brand of nativism. According to Reid, we are naturally endowed with certain innate faculties and principles of mind that allow us to know the world accurately and furnish us with essential truths as well. Reid wrote, "Such original and natural judgments are, therefore, a part of that furniture which nature, with a capital N, had given to the human understanding. They are the inspiration of the Almighty. They serve to direct us in the common affairs of life, where our reasoning faculty would leave us in the dark, and all the discoveries of reason are grounded upon them. They make up what is called the common sense of mankind. When a man suffers himself to be reasoned out of the principles of common sense by metaphysical arguments, we may call this metaphysical lunacy." So philosophical reactionaryism. Continuing. Knowledge of the world is secure because of the God-given human constitution that delivers it. We are constructed by God to know his world. If we set aside his rejection of the way of ideas, we find that Reid's philosophy resembles Hume's in important aspects. Both of them looked in the characteristic Enlightenment way to human nature in their treatment of philosophical problems. Both looked upon science and philosophy as products of the human mind, which therefore had to be studied and erected upon a prior theory of human nature. Hume's theory was rather simpler than Reid's, but their goals and methods were quite similar. The most serious difference between them as advancers of the Enlightenment project was religious. A curious aspect of the nativism empiricism debates of the 18th century often escapes the modern secular eye. Following Darwin, we now assume that native constitution is a product of natural selection. Our ability to see depth, for example, stems from our having descended from originally arboreal apes for whom binocular vision was adaptive. However, most philosophers before Darwin believed in God and assumed that because God made human beings, whatever ideas or the principles he implanted must be true, unless God is a deceiver. Thus, Locke, staunch opponent of innate truths, never used the best counterclaim to so-called innate principles, namely to show that they may not be true. because Locke assumed that whatever God did implant must be true. Hume was an atheist, and his moderate skepticism was an inevitable result. Our faculties, not being God-given, may err. Reid, however, avoided skepticism by asserting that the Almighty implanted in us first principles, necessarily valid because of their source. Thomas Reid was a clergyman, perhaps a clergyman first and a philosopher second. Reid's version of the Enlightenment project stayed within the boundaries of religion. Hume's did not. Among the Scots, an important step toward psychology was taken by Reid's student, Dugald Stewart. Stewart, who was more reconciled to Hume than was Reid, abandoned the term common sense and used associative concepts extensively. His basic work, Elements of the Philosophy of the Human Mind, published in 1792, reads like an introductory psychology text based on everyday experience instead of laboratory experiments. There are sections on attention, association, learning, memory, imagination, and dreaming. Stewart wrote charmingly about magicians, jugglers, and acrobats to illustrate his points. His discussion of attention and memory have a contemporary air about them, with Stewart making some distinctions found in modern information processing psychology and citing everyday experiences to support them. Stewart followed Reid in dissecting the mind into component faculties, each of which is assigned its role in mental life and knowledge, influenced by Bacon. Stewart devoted 62 pages to showing the practical value of the study of psychology. In all, Stewart's work is engaging and attractive. Through Stewart especially, Scottish philosophy became quite influential, especially in America. Some of America's earliest college founders were adherents of the Scottish school, as were some important college presidents in the 19th century. In the hands of later writers, beginning with Stewart, Scottish philosophy became a readily acceptable psychology, intuitively appealing and consistent with Christianity. Most American colleges were, and many still are, religious. And in the 19th century, Scottish faculty, psychology was part of the moral sciences taught to students. The content of their moral thought we shall come to presently. All right. Once again, we're going to be reading to pages 170 or maybe 171. So, yeah, we're about to wrap this up. If you got any comments or questions, put them in the chat. I will try to read them before we wrap up this live stream. We only have about 2.5 more pages to go. Let's continue here. Oh, before I do that, let me take a quick nose break. Pardon me. All right. Continuing here. The Transcendental Pretense. Immanuel Kant, born 1724 and died 1804. Kant wrote, "Two things awe me most, the starry sky above me and the moral law within me." As Plato had been offended by the apparent cognitive and moral relativism of the sophists, Kant was offended by the apparent cognitive relativism of Hume and the apparent moral relativism of French naturalists. In his New Metaphysics, Kant attempted to refute Hume's skepticism and rescue the certainty of Newton's grand scheme by which gravity rules the starry sky. In his New Ethics, to which we will return, Kant rebutted moral skepticism by grounding moral judgment in cognitively formed formal rules that govern a stern moral will. Kantian philosophy, reasserting metaphysics. Kant said that Hume's skeptical arguments roused him from his dogmatic slumbers. Before reading Hume, Kant had been a follower of Leibniz through his teacher, Christian Wolff, born 1679 and died in 1754. However, Hume's skepticism disturbed Kant's Leibnizian dogmatism. Like Plato with regard to the sophists, Kant saw Hume's conclusions as undermining the possibility of human knowledge. With Plato, Kant sought transcendent truth and was not content with merely useful truths. To rescue truth, Kant deployed metaphysical arguments about the mind rather than Hume's empirical ones. He realized that the old speculative metaphysics about God and humankind's spiritual substance was no longer viable. However, Kant could not accept Hume's merely psychological analysis of knowledge and wanted to prove the validity of human knowledge quite apart from any empirical facts about human habit formation. He thus reasserted the claim of philosophical metaphysics over psychology to be the foundation of the other sciences. All right. Zark 1000 says, "How you doing, Mr. Simon?" I'm doing well. Thank you, Zark. I'm doing quite well. I'm doing well, Zark. I'm going to write that here. Doing well, Zark. And yourself. Welcome to the channel. How about you? How about you? Welcome to the channel. I'm going to send this out to everybody here. All right? So, all right, you come respectful, you get treated with respect on this channel. You feel me? Anyway, continuing here. So, Kant began, as Hume had, with the basic Cartesian framework, but devoted it in a very different way. Kant called the world of experience, the world as perceived in the Cartesian theater, phenomena. The world of things in themselves he called the noumena. Like almost everyone else in the 18th century, Kant took Newtonian physics as the paradigm of genuine human knowledge. Science rests on observations and is therefore necessarily tested against experience, that is, against phenomenon. Framed this way, the question of human knowledge of truth depends upon the nature of phenomenon, not the nature of noumena. Kant then investigated how phenomenon arise in the mind, asserting that the mind necessarily structures experience in universal ways that make claims to truth potentially valid. Kant thought that empiricist philosophy went astray because it made the natural and intuitive assumption that external, noumenal objects impose themselves on understanding, which conforms itself to them. Hume's concept of impression expresses this assumption clearly. In perception, objects impose themselves on the mind the way a signet ring imposes a pattern on wax. For Kant, Hume's philosophy demonstrated that there must be something wrong with the naive assumption that the mind conforms itself to objects because it issues in skepticism. Kant turned Hume's hidden assumption on its head. Instead of the mind passively conforming itself to objects, Kant proposed that objects conform themselves to the mind, which actively imposes innate, a priori categories on experience. For example, Hume could find no justification for the assertion that every event has a cause because causes themselves elude observation. Kant asserted that while in noumena this may be true, in phenomena, the world we know and which science deals with, every event does indeed have a cause because the mind imposes causality on experience. The Wizard of Oz can be used to illustrate Kant's point. Oz is known as the Emerald City, but the movie does not reveal why. In the book, everyone who enters Oz is issued green spectacles that must be worn at all times. The spectacles make everything appear to be a shade of green, and thus Oz is the Emerald City. Now imagine that the citizens of Oz had green lenses implanted in their eyes at birth, but that the operation was kept a secret. The Ozites would grow up seeing everything as a shade of green, and would naturally conclude that, as empiricists say, because objects impress themselves on the mind, everything appears green because everything is, in fact, green. We know, on the other hand, that things appear green to the Ozites because of the altered nature of their eyes. In their case, objects conform themselves to the mind because the Ozite mind imposes itself on objects. Observe now that Ozites can assert at least one truth that cannot be falsified in the realm of phenomenon. Everything, meaning every phenomenon, is green. Kant's idea is that the human mind, or more precisely the human transcendental ego or self, imposes certain transcendental categories of understanding on experience, such as three-dimensional space, number, and causality. In Kant's usage, transcendental means logical and necessary. He believed He believed he had proved that his categories were logically necessary preconditions for any kind of experience whatsoever by any conscious being whatsoever. Thus, with regard to phenomenon, the realm of what human beings can know, we can assert certain truths, such as every event has a cause, or objects exist in three-dimensional space. Hume's skepticism about the possibility of unrefutable knowledge is thus rebutted. On the other hand, certain questions that seem at first glance to be straightforward were, Kant held, questions that have no answers because they cannot be addressed within the realm of phenomenon. The oft-contested question of the existence of God is one of these because God exists outside the realm of phenomenon. Arguments for and against God's existence are of equal validity or invalidity. Kant did not assert, as Hume did, that because we cannot perceive God, God does not exist, but that God's existence or non-existence is a question that the human mind cannot answer. Kant set limits on skepticism, but he did not entirely defeat it. Kant thought he had proved the transcendental validity of his innate concepts, but from a modern perspective, these concepts, if they exist, are evolutionary designs, not metaphysically necessary conditions of all consciousness. Kant's explanation is therefore just as psychological as Hume's or as physiological as Reid's. In other words, what applied to Reid as against Hume applied to Kant as well. The major difference between Hume on the one hand and Reid and Kant are the other is the amount and nature of innate equipment humans come with. The verdict of history is mixed on this score. Kant has been supported by findings that the perception of three-dimensional space is innate, but he has been undermined by modern quantum physics in which not all events have causes, and the construction of non-Euclidean geometrics, which Kant implied were inconceivable. Kant's philosophy directly influenced the Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget. Kant taught a form of idealism, maintaining that the world of experience is constructed by the transcendental categories of perception. Piaget studied the process by which the categories and the construction of the world develop in growing children. Indeed, one of his works was entitled The Construction of Reality by the Child, and other works study each Kantian category in turn. The child's conception of space, the child's conception of time, of number, and so on. All right, we're going to pick up here on Kant on scientific psychology next time we read, and we're going to finish all of chapter 6 with another 20 pages. Hopefully you enjoyed this reading. I sure did. I found this very enlightening and fascinating, though I will have to listen to this episode again to catch all of what was being put down, because it got very, very deep, very philosophical. But once again, this is an excellent book by and large, especially when he's talking about the history of these strands of thought and the history of philosophy, which I'm very interested in. And hopefully you enjoy this live stream. Catch y'all possibly tomorrow, maybe later today. Who knows? I might wrap up